all of you. Good morning. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to moderate this fascinating program by Nicholas Anderson. Nick Anderson has been a visiting scholar in residence at the Institute for Security and Conflict Studies here at the Elliott School at George Washington University. He is just finishing up his Ph.D. in the Department of Political Science at Yale University. And he focuses on East Asia and generally on international security issues. He has written and researched on questions dealing with territorial expansion and U.S. foreign policy, nuclear proliferation, and deterrence. Before coming to GW, he was a pre-doctoral fellow at the International Security Program at Harvard's Kennedy School, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He has received a number of fellowships, very prestigious fellowships, to do his research, and he has been quite prolific, publishing in some of the top journals in our field in international security, political science quarterly, the Washington Quarterly, and the Strategic Studies Quarterly. He received his MA from Georgetown University and his BA in Political Science and International Affairs from the University of British Columbia. So we're delighted to have you, Nick, and we look forward to your presentation. So the floor is yours, Nick.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen and full screen. Thank you everyone very much for being here. Thank you to the Sigur Center and Professor Mochizuki for providing me the opportunity to present my research on the Warring States period. This is the first time I've been able to present it in such detail, so this is really a great opportunity for me, and I'm looking forward to your feedback and questions. I also want to thank Netflix. I don't know if others are aware, but Netflix has just released a docudrama series called The Age of Samurai, which covers the unification of Japan towards the end of the Warring States period. So it's making my arcane historical research feel kind of more hip and more relevant. So for those who haven't seen it, I've watched the first half, really enjoyed it. I highly recommend it. So just as some background, basically I've been engaged in a data collection effort spanning roughly the past 5 years. I've been collecting data on a variety of political phenomena during Japan's Warring States period. So battles between warlords, territorial conquest within the Japanese archipelago, alliances between warlords, various aspects of the medieval provinces, the voluntary transfer of territory, gift giving, surrender, and natural disasters. My motivation is basically to conduct, mixed methods research on Japan's Warring States period. So to combine the quantitative data that I'm collecting and existing qualitative historical research to sort of examine a variety of different things of interest in the period. I should say, as a sort of caveat, I'm not a historian. I'm not a historian of Japan. As Professor Mochizuki said, I'm a political scientist in training, and I very much approach it that way. I'll also just say that sort of nothing like this currently exists, as at least as far as I'm aware. So most research on the Warring States period in Japan is historical and qualitative in nature. The major quantitative data sets that exist typically only cover the modern period, so the sort of after the Napoleonic Wars. Thinking here of the Correlates of War project, Correlates of Wars data on wars, alliances, and territorial change. Data sets that do cover pre-modern era periods tend to be light on Japan. So BRCA's conflict catalog includes only 48 conflicts for the Warring States period in Japan. Of course, I have considerably more than that. And data sets that cover pre-modern East Asia tend to not include or have not yet included Japan. So they focus on China, Korea, and Vietnam. The long-term goal with this project is to write a series of articles, hopefully publish a series of articles, and possibly in the longer run, a book based on them. So just to outline the presentation today, I will start with a very brief historical background of the Warring States period for anyone who isn't sort of initiated. We'll briefly talk about data collection procedures. We'll then introduce the data itself. We'll go into some detail on the battle data, and then very briefly through the conquest, alliances, and natural disasters data. I will introduce one application of the data to show you kind of the kinds of things we can do with it, the kinds of things we can learn before concluding the presentation. So the Warring States period in Japan is conventionally thought of as running from 1467 to 1600. An argument can be made that it started earlier and ended later, but this is by far the most common periodization. It begins with the Onin War, which broke out in the capital Kyoto. A shogunal succession dispute led to the outbreak of a civil war that lasted roughly 10 years. Many of the provincial officials who were stationed at the capital fled back to the various regions and provinces of Japan, only to find that they had been overrun by neighbors, or they had been usurped by their subordinates in the province. The traditional power structures in Japan, the shogun and the emperor, were weakened to the point of virtual non-existence, and you get the emergence of these provincial warlords known as the Sengoku daimyo, and the most powerful of them established themselves in castle towns like that pictured on the right. This is Matsumoto Castle. It was established in the early 16th century in what was then Shinano Province, what is now Nagano Prefecture. So you get about 100 years of warfare occurring. Towards the end of the Warring States period, you get the emergence of who became known as the three unifiers of the Sengoku period, or the Warring States: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. These three, sort of together and in sequence, pacified the other daimyo and unified Japan, first under Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1590, and then sort of permanently under Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1600. So that's the background. In terms of data collection process, the primary source that I've been using is a very detailed and comprehensive and authoritative chronology known as Shinkokushi Dai Nempyo. As far as I know, this is the most detailed chronology of Japanese history that's available. It covers over 1,000 pages for the Warring States period of political, social, and economic events, literally tens of thousands of entries. So this was the primary source of the data. I supplemented it in some cases with Japan Knowledge and online encyclopedia, Nihon no Senshi, another book, and other various articles as needed. I've been working with a tireless research assistant for the past 5 years. And I should also say I've been gotten the generous support of the Japan Foundation to conduct this research. Each observation in the data that sort of has ended up in the data has been audited at least twice by me, so checked against the original source twice by me and once by the RA, so trying to have good quality control in how it was collected. And I should say that Shinkokushi Dai Nempyo, each entry cites to a primary or secondary source, so the source itself is quite reliable. So now we'll talk about the data. So this is a famous screen of the Battle of Sekigahara, which occurs in 1600 at the end of the Warring States period. I should mention this is not at all a representative battle. In fact, it's the largest battle that occurs in my data. It's one of the largest battles ever to take place on Japanese territory. Roughly 170,000 troops took place. But it does give you a good sense of what I want to do here is just give you a quick sense of what battle looked like at the time. So I will just jump into this spot here. So as you can see on this picture, most individuals are fighting on foot, a number of people on horseback. They are armed with spears and with pikes and with swords. On the left-hand side here, you can see there are some people carrying guns. The Portuguese arquebuses came in the mid-16th century, and so you have a volley fire there. But this is basically what combat looks like at the time. So in terms of the battle data itself, for the purpose of this data, I define battle as the organized use of military force, one army on another army, or an army on a military target, such as a castle or a fortified town. The unit of analysis for the battle data is the individual battle. So if multiple sort of people are taking part in the same battle, it still counts as just a single observation. The structure of the data is dyadic, so you have one sort of battle, one contending party on either side of the dyad. And for each observation, I include a number of pieces of information that are kind of useful and relevant. So the date on which the battle took place, the actors involved, the location of the battle, who initiated the battle, which side initiated, which side wins the battle, and whether one or both sides fight as part of a coalition. And of course, the source in the data, the specific source in the data where the information was derived. The battle data is 2,889 observations, so quite detailed. I'll very brief, well, we'll just look at some of the ways that you can see variation by date, by actors, and by location, starting with the date. So this is what the battles look like plotted over time. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of year-to-year variation. You get roughly something like 15 or so battles a year through much of the early Warring States period. This jumps up to in the 20s as you get on and climbs all the way to sort of an average of perhaps 40 and peaks at about 85 in roughly 1582. I'll just mention, this sort of steady increase that you see in the battle data. It could be the result of an actual secular increase in battle. It could also just be that the information is the historical record is more complete the farther you go in time. It's very difficult to know which one of these is true. I think it's probably a combination of both, but I just wanted to flag that. This is what the battle data looks like distributed by month. So as you can see, on the y-axis is a count of the number of battles for each month, and on the x-axis are the individual months. So as you can see, the spring and the fall, or late summer and fall, stand out as the fighting seasons. You'll also notice that the winter months, the 1st and 12th months, are associated with a lot less battle. You'll also notice that the 6th month in the middle sees a pretty sort of dramatic decrease in battle. I think this is almost certainly due to the monsoon. Anyone who's been in Japan in June knows it can be quite wet, and I think that's what explains that. This distribution by sort of season is actually, you can see it change over the space in Japan. So this figure on the left-hand side is the battles by month, but only for the 4 northernmost provinces. Those are the provinces pictured on the right here. So this is Dewamutsu, Echigo, and Sado province. This is contemporary Niigata, Fukushima prefecture, and further north. So a couple of things are kind of noteworthy in the figure on the left-hand side. Number one, there's a sort of a sharper difference between the sort of spring and summer months and the winter months. And 2, there's a much less noticeable change associated with the monsoon. And again, this is consistent with what we know about Japanese climate. If we look at the south, the picture is again quite different. So this is the figure on the left is all the provinces that make up Kyushu, 11 provinces, and as you can see, there's much less seasonal variation. So you have basically the exact same number of battles in the 1st month as you do in the 7th month. Because of the climate, there's much less seasonal effects. The other thing is that the effect of the monsoon, if that's what this is in the 6th month, is quite dramatic. And again, this is consistent with what we know about sort of the climate in Japan as it exists. You can also look at the distribution of battle across space. So the figure on the left-hand side shows the 5 provinces with the most battles observed in the data and the 5 provinces with the least battles observed in the data. The map on the right-hand side is basically like a heat map. So darker means more battle. And so, yeah, as you can see, Yamashiro, which is the province where Kyoto is located, sees the most battle, followed by Setsu, which is right beside it, and then Shinano, which is sort of up a little bit further north in the middle here, and Mutsu province all the way up in the north, and finally Hizen in Kyushu. So those are the 5 greatest, 5 most battle observations in the data. One thing I think that's kind of interesting is in the middle, right beside Yamashiro here, where I'm putting the laser pointer, is Iga province. For anyone who has started the Warring States Japan documentary on Netflix, there's a section devoted to it. This is where the sort of ninja are thought to have originated, these unconventional warriors, and it's interesting that you see so little battle there. I think it has a lot to do with their autonomy and with the mountainous terrain there. Finally, you can see interesting distributions by actor. So the figure on the left-hand side, the blue line shows the number of battles that these actors engage in. The orange line shows the number of times they initiate. These are the 10 individuals who engage in the most battle in the data. The combination of the blue and orange line gives you a sense of sort of how aggressive these actors are. So the closer these 2 lines are together, the more often they are initiating the battles that they take place in. Topping the list, of course, is Oda Nobunaga, pictured on the right here. He's both sort of engaged in the most battles and incredibly aggressive. I think over 80% of the battles he engages in are initiated by him. But the remainder of the names are familiar to anyone who maybe went to took history classes in high school in Japan. Mori, Takeda, Uesugi, Tokugawa, and Toyotomi. So that's the battle data. We'll very briefly talk about the conquest data and conquest alliances and natural disasters. So conquest is the forcible transfer of territory from one actor to another. The unit of analysis here is the individual conquest observation. So if a conquest involves multiple actors, it still counts as just a single observation. The data is again dyadic. So you have the gaining side on one side of the dyad and the losing side on the other side of the dyad. And with each observation, I include a bunch of information that's relevant. So the date on which it took place, the actors involved, the specific territory that is acquired, whether it was the pacification of an entire province, and whether it was an expropriation that didn't involve sort of, actually armed conflict. It was just sort of forcibly expropriated. There are 1,224 observations in the conquest data. I'll very briefly show you what it looks like by actor. So the figure on the left-hand side shows the 10 actors who are most represented in the conquest data. At the very top, of course, is Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He's pictured on the right. He's the one who is the first unifier of Japan in its entirety, and so it's not surprising that he leads the list of the most sort of the conquerors of Japan, followed again by a very similar cast of characters: Oda Nobunaga, Takeda Shingen, Tokugawa Ieyasu, and so on. I also have data on alliances between warlords. These I define as more or less formal, enduring political military alignments between at least two actors. So the unit of analysis is the individual alliance formation observation. Unfortunately, I don't have information on how long these alliances lasted, sort of when they dissolved. It was available in some cases, but definitely not all, so I decided to just leave it out entirely, but I still think it's useful to know when alliances are being formed. Structure of the data is again dyadic, so you have one allying party on either side of the dyad. And for each observation, I include the date on which the alliance was formed, the actors involved, the rival, so the actor that the alliance was formed to either defend against or possibly attack when that information was available, whether the alliance was formal in any sense, so whether it was sort of codified in writing or whether it involved an exchange of hostages or a marriage or this kind of thing. And whether it was bilateral or multilateral. There are 576 observations in the alliance data. I will briefly show you the sort of difference between the actors and the rival actor. I think the sort of rival variable took a long time to generate, but I think it's most useful for people who might be interested in things like the balance of power theory and international relations. This is what this can show you: who's causing the most alliance formation against them. So this is what the actor and rival data looks like. On the left-hand side, we have the top 10 actors who engage in the most alliance formation. On the right-hand side, we have the top 10 actors who cause the most alliance formation. These are the actors who the alliances are formed against. And so Tokugawa and Toyotomi on the left-hand side are the ones who engage in actually quite a lot more alliance formation than others. And on the right-hand side, Oda Nobunaga is the one who is prompting the most alliances. I think it's quite interesting. I'll add that Toyotomi Hideyoshi barely makes the top 10 in terms of alliance rivals, despite the fact that he conquers all of that territory. I think that is a testament to his skill as a power politician, and I'm happy to talk more about that if people are interested in the Q&A. Okay, well, last bit of data I'll present is the natural disasters data. This is the newest data. I've just sort of finished putting this together. Basically, this is I define it as a major adverse event resulting from natural processes. The unit of analysis is the individual disaster. So if the disaster runs across multiple years, it still counts as just one observation. I include the date and the location of each disaster. I also include the nature of the event. So the disaster data includes cold waves, crop failures, droughts, earthquakes, epidemics, famines, floods, hail, landslides, locust infestations, extended rains, heavy snows, severe storms, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. It has a total of 656 observations. I'll briefly show you what the distribution of events in the data look like. So severe storm is the most common event in the data. Earthquake is the second most common, again, not surprising, this being Japan with respect to earthquakes, followed by flooding, famine, and so on. So this is obviously a less kind of political, social data set, but I thought, the information was available, and I started collecting it, and I think hopefully it'll be useful to some. Okay, so that's the data. The question that we may be wondering is sort of what's it good for? Why do we need this? Why do we want this? I think there's all sorts of questions that we could ask and try and answer with the data. I will present one application here. So a question that is common in conflict literature is whether conflict diffuses over space and time. Does it sort of spread in a contagious way in the same way that a virus spreads among a population? So the conventional wisdom, the sort of resounding answer from the conflict literature is yes, that conflict does diffuse. Diffusion has been observed in many forms of political violence, including interstate war, civil war, ethnic conflict, insurgency, rebellion, and terrorism. So what I am aiming to do here, and this is pretty crude and pretty preliminary, but I'm aiming to sort of see if that holds in warring states Japan. Does this occur here? So the question sort of in a strict sense is, does the sort of battle that take place in a given province and a given time, is it influenced by battles that took place sort of nearby in the relatively recent past? So obviously from the battle data, the most important pieces of information are the date and the location of the battle, and the location by province. So just to give you a sense of what the spread of battle across Japan looked like throughout the Warring States period, this is the total number of provinces that experience conflict by a given year. So it sort of counts up as they add more, as the data adds more years. So as you can see, in 1467, the first year of the Onion War, roughly 15 provinces experienced conflict. By the end of the Onion War, we're at roughly 38 or so. By the turn of the century, it's at 55 provinces have experienced at least one battle, and so on and so forth. By 1550, we're over 60. And by the end of the Warring States period, all but one, so 67 provinces experience battle. So clearly there's, it's spreading widely in Japan geographically. That said, it doesn't mean that it spreads, it does spread quite unevenly over time. So in any given year, most provinces are not experiencing battle. So for most of the warring states, so this figure shows the percentage of provinces that experience conflict by year for each year. So in the sort of early Onion War years, on the left-hand side, roughly 18% of provinces in any given year experience battle. This drops to roughly 12% for most of the remaining sort of 70 years, jumps up to maybe 15 or 18%, and then it climbs to roughly 25% of provinces experiencing battle in any given year. But in no year is it higher than 36%. So most of the time, most provinces don't see any battles, at least according to my data. But the question, of course, is sort of whether there's a relationship between sort of these battles across space and across time. So in order to figure this out, the unit of analysis that I have is the province year. There are 68 provinces in the medieval Japanese system. 5 of them are islands, so I exclude those from the analysis because they have no neighbors. So it's 63 provinces over 134 years. That leads to 8,442 province years. The outcome of interest that I'm sort of looking for is the occurrence of at least one battle in a given province in a given year. So I don't count the number of battles. I just say, is there battle or not? That's the outcome. The key explanatory variable is the occurrence of at least one battle in a proximate province in the relatively recent past. So by proximate, I mean sharing a land border. So only those that actually share provincial borders count as adjacent or proximate. And recent is the same or the prior calendar year. So a minimum of 1 day, maximum of 24, just under 24 months. I also include a number of controls in the analysis, including a count of the number of neighbors that the province has, its area in kilometers squared. I include a control for the region that has the most, is the most kind of conflict prone, just to make sure it's not sort of bouncing around in one region. And I include the terrain ruggedness of the province itself, topographic variability measured by the terrain ruggedness index. I use a linear probability model. So this is ordinary least squares regression with just this dichotomous outcome with two-way fixed effects for province and year to try and control for problems over space and time and robust standard errors in the reporting. And this is the first analysis. So as you can see in this coefficient at the top, there does appear to be some relationship between battle in an adjacent province in the prior year and battle in a given province in a given year, although the size of the effect is pretty small, roughly 1.8% increase, and it's not quite statistically significant according to conventional standards. So this isn't a ringing endorsement for the hypothesis that conflict spreads over space and time. But perhaps this shouldn't be entirely surprising, right? This is the political map of Japan during the Warring States period. This is the topographic map. So as we're dealing with one of the most mountainous territories on Earth. We're talking about 15th and 16th century infrastructure, logistics, transportation technology. So it's not exactly easy to get around, certainly not as easy to get around as it is now. And perhaps that would make the spread of battle sort of more difficult. This brings us to the importance of considering topography, considering terrain, considering logistics in the study of the diffusion of conflict. So the woodblock print on the right-hand side is a depiction of Shinano Province, which is Nagano Prefecture. According to the Terrain Ruggedness Index, it is the most topographically varied province in the Warring States period. And I think the picture on the right captures that really well. So I try to account for terrain by a second analysis. So basically what I do in this case is limit what I consider to be adjacent provinces to only those that share a major road. So I'll show you what I mean by that in the next slide. So this is a picture of the road network in the Warring States period. So you'll see on the right-hand side here, we have Dewa and Mutsu provinces. They share a major road. So I do consider these to be adjacent because of that road. But Echigo and Dewa do not share a major road. So I do not, for the purpose of the analysis, consider them to be adjacent like I did in the first analysis. So we're basically only looking at provinces that share major roads as those that are considered to be adjacent, and we should expect to see diffusion. And in the second model on the right-hand side here, you can see that actually seems to be the case. So this second coefficient is the one that matters. It's the one that has the road network data embedded in it. And as you can see, the size of the effect is roughly double. So it's now 3.3% increase in the odds of battle and highly statistically significant. So I think that, what I sort of take away from this is that it does seem that conflict does diffuse over the Warring States period in Japan, though you have to be very mindful of logistics, of transportation technology, and transportation networks. So just to sum up, I've presented this new data that I've collected on the Warring States period in Japan. We looked at the battle data, the conquest data, alliance data, and natural disasters data. And we sort of went through an application for a contemporary sort of research question in the conflict literature, whether conflict diffuses over space and time. I hope that this data is of interest to historians, to area study scholars, to other political scientists, other social scientists. And my other hope is, of course, that this is the beginning and not the end of this kind of project. I'm very much or very close to the end of producing this data. I'm planning on submitting a version of this for publication in the coming months. But I hope that other people sort of find it interesting, find it useful, download the data and try and examine it and learn new things. I hope that others want to build on it in terms of collecting more data. I'm sure that there's stuff that's missing in my data, and so it would be great if others decide that they would like to build on it. So that is the end of my presentation. I'll just say that I would love to chat with people who are interested in hearing more. I'm also, like, to be completely honest, looking for some people to collaborate on research on this topic. So if you're particularly like a historian who works on this, I would love to chat with you about potentially collaborating on projects together. And if anyone's interested in sort of having access to the data once it becomes available, that's my website, and I will most certainly be posting it there when it is ready. So that is all. Thank you very much for your attention, and Professor Mochizuki, I look forward to your comments.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Nick. First of all, my hats off to you and your research assistant for putting together this data. I mean, I can just imagine the the amount, just the scale of the work that was involved, and having to go through just pages and pages of documents to do this. And so, as someone in the Japan field, I'm very appreciative of this, and it's great that this data will eventually be available to anyone who's interested in it, so that they can mine the data to investigate a number of questions. We've already gotten a lot of questions from the audience, and so what I like to do is to first group, I think, 3 questions that naturally kind of relate to each other. One deals with your data regarding battles, and the question is that what were the, do you have any sense of the scale of the battles? Is there kind of an average size of the battle, and what the distribution of the scale of the battle might be? And to what extent you've restricted the battles in your data set to battles taking place on the Japanese archipelago, or whether you also include battles that take place, in the Korean Peninsula. I guess this is with the Hideyoshi campaign. And then related to that is the issue of analyzing campaigns versus battles. So you disaggregated this information using battle as the unit of analysis, but have you kind of reaggregated the battles into thinking in terms of campaigns and analyzing campaigns? So that's kind of the first set of questions that I've collected. So maybe you could answer those, and then I'll look at some of the other questions.
Sure, thank you very much. These are really interesting and important questions. So in terms of the scale and size, that information is available. It is included in the data. It's pretty sparse, to be completely honest. In the vast majority of cases, there's no information on the size of the battles. Obviously, as I said, the largest battle is like 80 or 90,000 per side, Sekigahara. Most of them are much smaller. Most of them are dozens or hundreds of individuals. So they're sort of much smaller in scale. As you know, when the data is available, it will be it will include the size data, but I'll obviously have a strong caveat that it's very, very sparse, and not. I think it's probably reliable, but just not that there's not that much data. In terms of the question about the Japanese archipelago, yes, I do restrict it to the Japanese archipelago. I initially wanted to include the invasion of Korea. The problem that I ran into was that so I do read Korean, so the source I was using is a Japanese source, and it was very hard for me to. All of the locations in Korea were written in Japanese, and so I had a very hard time figuring out, okay, where is this battle taking place? It would have been a lot easier to use a Korean language source, I think, for that. So I think someday I may go back and include all these battles. I have a list of battles, but it's very sort of the locations of them are quite unreliable. So that's why I haven't included them in this initial collection. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting and important sort of addition that I'm kind of looking at. As far as campaigns go, yeah, I have not aggregated them at that level. I think it would. So some of them are very obvious, like when Hideyoshi goes and conquers Kyushu and Shikoku. So there are kind of easy kind of campaigns that really are easy to put together. Others would be harder. I guess I'll leave this to other researchers who are interested and frankly probably know more about the Warring States period than I do to be able to kind of do this in a really accurate way. But thank you. These are great thoughts and great questions.
Okay, in the next set of questions, I wanted to kind of zoom out. These are more general questions. And one is kind of what sparked your interest in doing this research, looking at this period in Japan. And another question is why really was there no kind of research, kind of academic research? I mean, you've talked about a lot of the historical or qualitative work that has been done, but why before you started to do this was there no effort to kind of that of to kind of collect this data and do it systematically. And another general question is, you looked at the question about conflict diffusion, but putting your political science hat on, kind of what other kind of general questions do you think this data might be useful for? I know that recently there's been a lot of terrific work on conflict and war in China, in traditional China, and people have asked the question about how a hegemonic order gets established, and we know the end of the story of this Warring States period. We have a hegemonic order established under the Tokugawa family, and so I'm just wondering if there are other general questions that you find that this data might be very useful to investigate. So, what sparked your interest? Why no research before? And what are some other general questions that you could address?
Sure, thank you very much. So, in terms of my own interest, so I was talking to Professor Mochizuki before the event, and initially it's sort of a mundane answer, but it was an assignment in a class in my first year of a Ph.D. at Yale with Stathis Kalivas on civil wars, and I decided to look at this period in a kind of very macro way, read some of the history, and write up a paper. I then got a series of Japan Foundation grants in order to continue the work, and with those grants, I sort of started collecting data. I mean, personally think it's sort of inherently interesting. I mean, as a sort of a student of international relations, the Japanese archipelago does look sort of like the traditional sort of definition of what we refer to as anarchy in international relations. So a bunch of sort of actors that are autonomous and no sort of authority structure above them. So how do they sort of align and fight and maybe not fight and make peace and this kind of thing? So I think, the period lends itself really well to sort of analysis from the perspective of international relations theory. So I think that's probably the reason why I initially got interested in it. In terms of why there's not more existing data, so first of all, there's an enormous historical literature, which is absolutely phenomenal. For anyone who's interested, like, I think the best historian working on this in the United States is Mary Elizabeth Berry at UC Berkeley. She's moved on sort of to other topics in pre-modern Japan, but her book entitled Hideyoshi is an absolutely fantastic book. If you're going to own one book on this period, I would recommend owning this book. So there's a lot of great historical research, both in the U.S. and in Japan. I think in terms of why there hasn't been more sort of systematic data, typically, like, there's a sort of a strong presentist bias in a lot of political science research, I'll say. There's a lot of interest in contemporary questions with contemporary relevance. It's seen as sort of risky to go back and look at sort of history in a very detailed way in political science. So I think that there are not sort of strong incentives to collect this kind of data. I think that's probably the main reason why. I think that these chronologies, so the Shinkokushi Dainenpyo that I have the Shinkokushi Dainenpyo that I collected, this is effectively a data collection effort. It's just in book form, not sort of on an Excel spreadsheet. So I basically just translated that, with obviously some interpretive work in the middle, but I translated what that was, what they have done there into a more sort of usable format on a computer. But basically, yeah, I think that there just aren't strong incentives in political science to look at some of this stuff. That said, I mean, there's sort of as Professor Mochizuki pointed out, there's sort of a movement and some interest in looking at the Warring States period of China, and there's some very good data being collected on that. So there is sort of, I was encouraged by these other efforts and thought I would try to put my hand in as well. In terms of what other questions can be examined here, so so I showed you a little bit on the diffusion of conflict. I mean, I have this Conquest data. There's a research on what are the causes of territorial conquest, maybe what are the effects. I think that the question of the unification of Japan is an interesting one. So we sort of take it for granted that it was Hideyoshi and it was 1590. So question number one that I think is interesting is why Hideyoshi and not Oda Nobunaga, or why sort of not a third person? And another interesting question is why Hideyoshi when it happened. There's a lot of answers in the historical literature, but hopefully, I can add to those that research with this stuff. Yeah, I do think that, balancing, I should say, I talked a bit about the balance of power. Research on whether, how balancing coalitions form, when they form, what their effects are. These are all sorts of things that I think can be examined here. So yeah, thank you.
Another set of questions is again back to the micro level, and one question asked to what extent kind of naval warfare entered into this Warring States period, and then the other is the impact of European military technology on these conflicts.
Thank you. So I didn't present it, but I do have an indicator in the data that indicates whether the battle in question had a naval component. This is also a very small number of battles. I think it's partly because we're talking about sort of, provinces on an archipelago. They didn't sort of, until the end of the Warring States period, they didn't go too far beyond the archipelago. And so a lot of the fighting actually does take place on land. It's possible that the source Shinkokuji Dainenpyo undercounts naval engagements. It's possible that the historical record is much thinner on naval engagements. That I don't actually know, but there is some naval warfare, but it's a much smaller percentage of the overall total. In terms of European technology, yeah, this is a very interesting question. I was, hopeful when I learned that, in sort of smack in the middle, or sort of, 3/4 of the way through the Warring States period, you do get the introduction of gun technology and cannon technology, and it eventually becomes widespread. It becomes sort of standard by the end of the Warring States period on the battlefield. I was very interested in sort of trying to get a sense of what effect this has on battle. So I started tracking the battles that mention the use of guns, or mention the use of cannons, to see if I could sort of distinguish those that had them and those that didn't. Unfortunately, the information is just not widespread enough. There's ways that you could sort of guess or sort of infer about where sort of guns would be based on the sort of data that I have and things that we know in the broader history, but I don't have great information on that. I mean, this was very much something I was interested in trying to figure out, seeing the sort of effect that this had, because it does, happen in a kind of random way, right? These shipwrecked Portuguese end up in Japan and transferring this technology to them, and then it becomes very widespread. So, but yeah, for now, I don't have great information on that.
Okay, another question relates to the role of women in this period, and so do you have any thoughts on that? I was watching some of the episodes of the Netflix series, and there are certain episodes when women play a key role at the elite level, either to try to restrain kind of a conflict, or on the other hand, to, in a sense, propagate the conflict as being someone who was used to bring kind of two warring daimyo together, or families together, and then the woman betrays one of the daimyo, and this leads to conflict. So do you have any kind of sense about the role of women in this period?
Yeah, so I'll say from the perspective of the data, women show up in two ways, or in two places. So there are actually, I unfortunately I don't remember off the top of my head, but there are two battles that actually involve women as the leader of armies. Now that's like obviously a pretty small number out of 2,000 or almost 3,000 battles, but I think it's notable. Yeah, so there are two battles that have women as leaders of armies. or at least they're sort of one of the contending sides. The other place that they show up in a not in a kind of direct way, but in an indirect way is in the alliance data. So many of the alliances are forged through political marriages or through the exchange of hostages, and they will often send their families, children and wives to their rivals to live in their castles, so that they have this sort of sense of assurance. This was a very, obviously a very tough time to be a woman, and given that the subject matter is all sort of conflict and security, they in the data itself they don't show up as obviously. But yeah, I do think that it's a very sort of, I think that the Netflix documentary does a good job of showing the important role that women played in this period, though they don't show up in things like the data that I collected in a really big way.
Another set of questions is less on the kind of the military aspects, but does your data get at kind of non-battle events? And so a case in which a province or a village chooses not to fight and just gives up to a warring faction. And another question I asked about gift-giving practices. So, how did you quantify gift-giving practices, and what kind of sources did you use to kind of capture that?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be able to talk about these. So, I do have some data on surrender. The way I basically, unfortunately, I don't have all of the numbers in front of me, but the way I define surrender is a situation in which one side effectively chooses not to fight before the battle. So if the battle begins, even if it's a siege and they give up throughout the siege, that counts as a battle. If the army approaches and the other side sort of waves the white flag, I consider that to be a surrender. I only have 112 observations of that. I'm sure that it occurs more often than I've been able to account for, but that's what I have. I think it's I'm interested in surrender because I do think that probably different actors were better able to prompt surrender than others. I think that the view was that Oda Nobunaga would just sort of, put everyone to death. And so probably he was less likely to prompt surrender. Probably people were more likely to be willing to fight even in really bad odds. It's possible that Toyotomi Hideyoshi was better able to prompt surrender, which is sort of part of the way that he manages to unify the country without fighting nearly as many battles. But that's something that I have to look at in a lot more detail before I'm sort of confident about it. The gift-giving data is quite interesting. So it's all basically from the same source. I think it was Shin Kokushi Dainenpyo. I think it's probably supplemented a little bit by these other sources. Basically, so there's 448 observations of gift-giving. All sorts of different kinds of gifts. I categorize them 4 or 5 ways. Sort of, there's like, they would give swords and armor to each other. Sometimes they would give sort of natural kinds of gifts, food or animals, or this kind of thing. They sent severed heads to each other after battles. Pretty grim, but I included that in the gift giving data. Obviously, they gave money to each other. So basically, what I have is 448 observations from 1467 to 1600 of the kinds of gifts. So who gave the gifts, to whom, when, and what kind, what's the sort of nature of the gift itself. There's some very interesting sort of recent research on this, a very good book of a scholar from University of North Carolina that I really enjoyed reading. So I'm interested in kind of digging more into that, seeing how this played a role in sort of political relations between warlords in this period. But that's basically the gift-giving data. That's what it consists of.
Great. So we're really just grilling you with so many questions, but here are some more political questions. So one person asks, to what extent did the Japanese warlords during this period actually seek to unify what they saw as Japan? I mean, did they actually view Japan as a cultural unit that would be unified someday? And then a couple of other related questions. What impact did the attempted Mongol invasion in an earlier period have an impact on the political landscape of Japan? And did the spread of Christianity in the southwest provinces have any impact on the number of battles in that area?
Yeah, these are interesting. These are difficult questions, interesting and difficult questions. So, um, in terms of how I think sort of Japanese warlords tended to see sort of Japan as a unit, I do. So, you know, the shogunate had been around for hundreds of years by this point, right? So there was this sort of political structure, and the sort of the emperor for even longer. But there was this political structure over sort of most of what we consider, or most of what we understand as Japan now, of course, without Hokkaido, today for hundreds of years. So I do think that there was this perception that, you know, this is a place that can be unified, perhaps that should be unified. I mean, I think historians are probably better able to answer these questions than I am. But I do think that given that, you know, it had been in existence for hundreds of years, I think it's very likely that it was viewed that way. Doesn't mean that every single sort of warlord was aiming to unify the country under their rule, but certainly there were pushes from different quarters. Certainly there were contenders for that sort of, for establishing that that unified shogunate, and it just so happened that it was Hideyoshi who did it, and then Tokugawa after him. So that's basically where I land on that one. I've forgotten the other two questions. I'm sorry. Sorry, you're still on mute. I'm sorry.
The southwest provinces and whether that had an impact on the number of battles in that part
Yes.
Of Japan.
Thank you. Yeah. So the Christianity question is also interesting and important. I'll just say as sort of a side note here, one of the indicators that I have in the battle data, which I didn't mention in the presentation, is something that I call irregular. I refer to as irregular. So this is basically when a battle participant is sort of a non-warlord actor. This also comes up in the Netflix docudrama, but there were these sort of radical Buddhist sects that had very powerful armies, and they show up a lot in the battle data, and basically to indicate that this battle involves an actor like that. There are other actors I consider irregular, some Christian communities, for instance, or pirates. In a couple of cases, the shogun himself, Ashikaga shogun, you know, participates in a battle, and so I include him as an irregular actor. So I do have an indicator that shows you when they take place. You know, there's a lot of battle that takes place in southern Japan. I can't say whether this sort of the role that Christianity played, but I do think that those who sort of have a good sense of the sort of history of this region of Japan can kind of take this data and look at, you know, hopefully with the help of this indicator of irregular actors, and can sort of begin to answer some of these questions.
There was a question regarding the role of mercenaries or warriors from other countries. Did they get involved at all in the Warring States period?
Yeah, so very few. I do have, I think I have 4 or 5 battles out of roughly 3,000 where the Japanese are fighting some foreign force that's come to Japan. It's like, these are like, you know, European sort of sailors or traders, and they end up having like a brawl on the docks, this kind of thing. It's not like a big organized battle. There certainly were foreigners. There's you know, some interesting research on an African person who sort of became one of these warlords in the Warring States period. You know, it came up in my research, but typically, like, so I should say that the people who show up in my battles are the leaders of armies. It's not like I include sort of everybody who fought. So it tends to kind of wash out any of these foreigners if they weren't actually engaged in the battle as leaders of armies. But yes, they certainly did play a role, and it does show up a little bit the data I've collected.
I have a very general question, and I know when one looks at the Chinese discourse, a lot of people point to the work Three Kingdoms and the Warring States period in China as providing great insights into the Chinese tradition of strategy and strategic culture. And of course, some people might disagree with that, but definitely the impact in China of the Three Kingdoms that is undeniable in Chinese popular culture. So I'm wondering, there's a lot of literary fiction written about this period, and they are very popular in Japan. And then there are a number of kind of anime that are inspired by the Sengoku Jidai. I was wondering, what you see as the legacy of this period on Japanese strategic thinking and strategic culture.
Thank you. That's an interesting question. So I would put myself in the kind of camp or category of people that are a little suspicious of strategic culture arguments. I just don't. So you're absolutely correct that it has this very, very present sort of feeling in sort of Japanese popular culture and society, and obviously education, this kind of thing. But it's very hard for me to see a sort of direct tie between the events of the Warring States period and sort of, let's say, Japanese defense and security today. I think that probably sort of the more fundamental drivers of the way that sort of Japan behaves today has to do with its geography and sort of the balance of power in its region and these kind of things. And I think that the idea that sort of the kind of history and narrative and discourse of strategy from hundreds of years ago has a profound impact upon strategic thinking today, I think is not something I'm easy to convince of personally. But I don't know, perhaps you have other thoughts, perhaps you.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I'm somewhat skeptical of the strategic culture argument. At least in contemporary Japan, certain styles of leadership that emerge in this period are often invoked. And so I remember when Ozawa Ichiro was a major driver of political change, and with and he was probably the most important figure leading to the fall of the LDP from power in 1993. And so many people said, well, he's the like Oda Nobunaga. He goes out. I mean, he is ruthless, and he goes out and he destroys. He forms alliances, but his personality gets in the way. That in the end, they move away from him. And so he was able to destroy, but not to establish a new order. And now he's much more of a minor figure. So I often hear about that, or the differences between Oda Nobunaga and Hideyoshi and Ieyasu about if the cuckoo doesn't sing, I'll wring its neck. If the cuckoo doesn't sing, I will make it sing. Or Ieyasu, you would just wait until it sings, and person ultimately achieves hegemony. So that's one way that it kind of is part of the Japanese discourse. But the other thing, and this struck me from watching the Netflix series, is the brutality of the conflict. Now, I know war is brutal, and it's brutal in other parts of the world too, but it was an effort to not just subjugate warriors, but to go after women and children, and basically, I mean, to exterminate, in some cases, the enemy. And it, I couldn't help thinking that, well, to what extent did that mentality enter into the way Japan fought China in the late 1930s, and the brutality of the Japanese campaign. So that was a kind of a more of a negative legacy that I saw of this Warring States period.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. Interesting thought.
So I think we're coming down to the end of our time period, and so I've got a couple of questions left. One question I think you've already addressed was disaggregating the different types of natural disasters, and I think you've done that, and then kind of the seasonalness of the battles, and the person asked about the agricultural calendar. But the other is, maybe it's a good way to end the program, is that do you have a list of historical sites? If someone was going to visit Japan, that you would recommend kind of going to illuminate this Warring States period. I was tickled when you showed a picture of the Matsumoto Castle, because my ancestors of the Mochizuki family comes from that part of Japan, and I think the family grave is in a small town very close to Matsumoto. But yeah, if you were advising someone that's visiting Japan and wanted to explore this history, what would be your kind of top historical sites to visit?
Oh yeah, I wish I had a better answer to this. So this is a great question. So I'll say that I have not been to Japan since I started this project. I've obviously been to like sort of Kinkakuji and some of these places that are associated with the Warring States period, but I haven't done sort of like the battlefield tour or tours, of which I'm sure there are many in Japan. If I ever get a chance to go back, I have two young kids, so trans-Pacific travel is like out of the question for us, at least for now. But if I ever get a chance to go back, I most certainly will be signing up for one of these, Sengoku tours, and maybe even catch a reenactment of some of these battles, like I know they do there. So yeah, my answer is not very good. One thing I will say is that in the paper version of this, I plan to have sort of a list of kind of prominent battles and where they show up in the data, and this would be a good place to start if you're interested in kind of some of what are the most pivotal battles. I obviously have the location, and you could look from there. But yeah, I don't have a great one for that. But thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I don't think, at least I don't think there is in English kind of a guide to these historic sites. So maybe this is a way that you could write a best-selling work to supplement your academic research. Yes. Well, Nick, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, and for so patiently and skillfully answering the numerous questions that were raised. I think it's just indicative of the interest that your data collection and research has kind of stimulated in the people who attended. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for your attention, and for your wonderful questions. And as Nick mentioned, he would very much like to chat with anyone, communicate with anyone who's interested in this research and data set. And I saw that there were a number in the audience that had a keen professional interest in this period of Japan and in East Asian history. So hopefully you will get some collaborators out of this program. So thank you very much, Nick. I want to thank the audience and Miriam and the Sigur Center staff for putting together this wonderful program. I hope to see all of you again at the next Sigur Center event dealing with Japan. So thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you.